The morning I left the Velshari homeworld, Princess Lyra threw a ceramic cup at my head. She missed. Barely. The cup shattered against the bulkhead behind me, and I stood there in the doorway of the nursery suite, age 26, first rotation diplomatic aide, looking at this 11-year-old alien girl with her silver-streaked hair and her 4 dark eyes brimming with rage and something else I couldn't name, and I thought, this is the worst assignment of my career. That was 14 years ago. I remember the cup sometimes. I remember the exact pitch of the sound it made when it hit the wall, a clean, high note like a small bell. I remember the way the pieces scattered across the polished stone floor. Lyra didn't look at the shards. She just kept looking at me. When you have 4 eyes arranged in a vertical column the way the Velshari do, you can track 2 separate points of focus simultaneously, and she was doing it then, 2 eyes on my face, 2 on the doorway behind me, measuring whether I'd run. I didn't run. I bent down and picked up the largest piece and held it out to her like it was a gift. "Nice throw," I said. "You pulled left, you want to work on that." She didn't speak to me for 3 days after that. Then she started asking questions. Now the questions are coming from a queen. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, or what the Interstellar Civilian Corps still calls a Tuesday, which is really just a bureaucratic fiction we cling to out of stubbornness. I was on Meridian Station, technically on leave, actually drinking bad coffee in the observation bay, and watching a cargo drone line up its approach vector for the 4th time, because someone had filed an incorrect docking permit. I was 40 years old and I had a comfortable life and a reputation as a man who was very good at solving problems that other people found unsolvable. And the last thing I wanted was a summons from Velshari space. The ICC courier who brought it was a young woman named Tessie, who had the look of someone who had been carrying a hot coal for 12 hours and was very relieved to put it down. The diplomatic seal on the message packet was real, not a forgery, not a political gambit, but the actual mark of the Velshari royal house, pressed in the iridescent wax that only the sitting monarch is authorized to use. I turned it over in my hands for a long time before I opened it. The message inside was 4 words. "Come, I want answers." I knew the handwriting. I had graded her assignments for 3 years. I booked passage on the first available transport out of Meridian Station, which happened to be a converted ore hauler called the Persistent Doubt. It was not a comfortable ship. The bunk was roughly the size of a coffin, and the heating system made a noise at irregular intervals that sounded exactly like someone clearing their throat in the next room, which meant I never fully slept the whole 11-day crossing. I lay in my bunk and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about Lyra. Not Queen Lyra Veleshin III, sovereign of the shining lattice, voice of the deep archive. Lyra, the girl who had thrown the cup. 11 years old when I met her. I had been assigned to her care during a diplomatic summit between the ICC and the Velshari conclave. 3 weeks of negotiations that my superiors euphemistically called a cultural exchange. And that was actually a very tense argument about mineral rights in the outer reaches. Someone in the diplomatic corps had calculated that keeping the royal heir occupied while her parents were in rooms full of lawyers would be a useful gesture of goodwill, and someone else had pointed at me and said I was good with kids. I was not, at the time, particularly good with kids. I was good at logistics. I was good at reading people's intentions from small behavioral signals. I was good at being very still when other people were loud. These qualities turned out to be more useful with Lyra than any formal childcare training would have been. She was, I say this as someone who has spent my career in alien diplomacy and dealt with more non-human personalities than most humans will encounter in a lifetime. She was extraordinary. Not in the way a royal child is supposed to be extraordinary, which is to say performatively, decoratively, in ways that are visible from a polite distance. She was extraordinary in the ways that are only visible up close, over time in the small moments. The questions she asked, the way she listened to answers, the specific texture of her stubbornness, which was different from ordinary childish refusal. It was the stubbornness of someone who had learned very early that most people would not tell her the truth, and who had decided to find it by some other route. 3 weeks, that was all it was supposed to be. On the 4th day, one of the summit sessions collapsed into a formal grievance filing, and the whole delegation was supposed to stay an additional 2 weeks while the legal framework was renegotiated. On the 17th day, Ambassador Velcori, Lyra's mother, took me aside and asked whether I would be willing to continue as her daughter's companion for an additional month. She asked it the way the Velshari ask favors that are actually commands, which is with great courtesy and absolute expectation. I said yes. On the 51st day of what had been a 3-week posting, I helped Lyra figure out that the locked door at the end of the nursery corridor led to a maintenance shaft that connected to the adult delegation's private garden, and we sat on the roof of that garden at 2 in the morning watching 3 of Velshari Prime's moons rise in succession, while she told me about the Deep Archive. The Deep Archive is the Velshari's repository of ancestral memory, not history, not records, but actual layered sensory memory preserved through a biological process I don't fully understand, and that involves the glands behind their secondary eyes. Every Velshari carries traces of their ancestors' experiences. Royal bloodlines carry more. Lyra told me that sometimes, when the lights were out and the station was quiet, she could feel the memories of queens who had died 300 years ago pressing against the inside of her skull like weather. "Does it hurt?" I asked. She considered this for a long time with the seriousness she brought to all questions that deserved it. "It's like pressure," she said, "like when you know something is coming but you don't know what." I nodded. I knew that feeling, though for entirely different reasons. We stayed on the roof until the 4th moon rose, and then I carried her back inside because she'd fallen asleep against my shoulder, and I stood in the nursery for a minute holding this alien child who weighed about as much as a large dog and who carried 300 years of ancestral pressure behind her eyes, and I thought, this is the best posting of my career. I was still 26. I was not yet wise enough to know what that thought would cost me. The persistent doubt dropped out of transit 12 hours ahead of schedule, which the captain announced over the intercom with the satisfied tone of someone who had done something excellent and wanted credit for it. I was awake because the throat-clearing heater had made its noise at exactly the wrong moment, and I lay in my bunk for 3 minutes staring at the ceiling before I got up and went to the observation bay. The Velshari homeworld at distance looks like someone held a piece of sky and wrung it. It has that iridescent quality, a planet that seems to shift color depending on the angle of the light, ranging from deep cobalt to something close to gold. They call it the shining lattice, and the name is accurate. From a transport window at half AU of distance, it looks like a jewel that forgot it was a planet. I'd seen it before, 3 times not counting the original posting. But there is something about seeing a place you associate with an important memory that does a particular thing to your chest, and I stood at the observation window with my coffee getting cold in my hands, and I let it do that thing for a moment. And then I put the feeling away somewhere useful and started thinking about what I was going to say to a queen. The difficulty was that I did not know what she wanted to ask me. The 4 words of her message, "Come, I want answers," gave me nothing useful to work with. Answers to what? In 14 years I had sent 3 official diplomatic dispatches to the Velshari court, all of them on behalf of the ICC, all of them purely procedural. I had sent 0 personal messages. I had not attended her coronation 4 years ago, which had been deliberate. Lyra had become queen at 21 following her mother's death in a transit accident, and the combination of her grief and her new responsibilities and the political complexity of the early transition period had seemed to me like an extremely good reason to stay very far away. There were other reasons I had stayed away. I had not examined all of them carefully. The ICC liaison officer who met me at the dock was a man named Voss who had the bureaucratic manner of someone who had been processing paperwork about things that were above his clearance level for so long that the manner had become load-bearing. He handed me a briefing packet and walked with me through the customs hall and told me, in a tone that carefully avoided conveying any information about his personal feelings, that my visit was classified at a diplomatic sensitivity level. That meant he couldn't actually tell me what the Queen wanted to discuss. "That's very helpful," I said. "I know," said Voss. He genuinely seemed to believe this. The briefing packet told me almost nothing. The Queen was well. The court was stable. There had been a period of political tension 6 months ago that had resolved. There was a state ceremony in 3 days for which my presence was expected. The briefing packet did not explain why my presence was expected at a state ceremony in 3 days, which meant that question was above Voss's clearance level too, and I was beginning to suspect that almost everything was. They put me in a guest suite in the outer wing of the palace complex, a comfortable room with a balcony overlooking a formal garden and walls the pale silver gray of good Velshari stonework. The heating worked. The bed was an approximation of human comfortable. Someone had left a plate of Velshari breadsticks on the table, which are roughly the consistency of very firm clouds and taste like nothing that exists in the human flavor vocabulary, but that I had become inexplicably fond of during my original posting. I ate 3 of them while standing at the balcony door and watching the garden go dark as the sun dropped behind the palace's western towers. The summons from the Queen's Chamberlain arrived 2 hours later, not for a formal audience for dinner. Private dining room, 3rd level, informal dress. I had not brought informal dress. I had brought diplomatic formal and a spare set of travel clothes. I chose the travel clothes. The 3rd level private dining room was small and lit, with the low amber lights that Velshari prefer for relaxed gatherings. There were 2 places set at a round table, and a spread of food that included what I recognized as several dishes from the menu of the nursery suite at that original diplomatic summit, which meant someone had done research. I stood inside the door for a moment looking at the food, and understanding that I had already been thoroughly outmaneuvered before I got through the door. Then Lyra came in. She was 25. I had seen photographs. The ICC keeps files on every allied sovereign, but photographs had not quite prepared me for the fact that she had become, in the intervening years, entirely herself. The girl who threw cups had been extraordinary in the ways only visible up close. The Queen who walked into that dining room was extraordinary in all the ways at once, including from across the room. She was wearing the informal court clothes of the Velshari, which are less ornate than ceremony dress but still carry a weight of presence, layered silks in the deep blue-black of the Velshari royal house. Her silver-streaked hair was longer now and braided. Her 4 eyes found me immediately, the way they always had, and for one very specific moment I felt exactly as I had in the nursery doorway 14 years ago. "You look exactly the same," she said. It was not a compliment, it was an observation. Lyra had never confused the two. "Your Majesty," I said. "Don't," she said. She moved to the table and sat and gestured at the chair opposite. "Sit. You've been traveling for 11 days in something that probably should have been decommissioned. Eat." I sat. I ate. She watched me with 2 of her eyes and looked at something across the room with the other 2, which meant she was thinking, which had always been her tell. We did not speak for several minutes. The food was very good. The breadsticks were also on the table. I noticed she had one on her plate half-eaten. I had once told her, during a long afternoon when the summit had run over and she was bored and I was her only distraction, that I'd come to genuinely like them. It had been an offhand remark. She had remembered it for 14 years. "You didn't come to my coronation," she said. "I wasn't invited," I said. "You would have been. If you'd let the ICC know you wanted to come. I didn't want to complicate your transition period. That's a very diplomatic answer. She set down her eating implement. The Velshari use a single curved tool that functions as both fork and knife, and looked at me with all four eyes, which with the Velshari is the equivalent of a human giving someone their full and complete attention, and also a slight warning. I have a court full of people who give me diplomatic answers. I didn't bring you 11 days across the reaches for a diplomatic answer. I put down my own utensil. All right, I said. I didn't come because I didn't know how to be there. Is that better? It was not quite honest. It was closer. She studied me for a long moment. I want to show you something, she said, after dinner. We ate the rest of the meal talking about other things. The political situation in the outer reaches, which was quietly complicated. The ICC's new protocols for joint operations with allied sovereign species, which I'd had a hand in drafting. A book she'd been reading about human explorers of the second expansion period, which she'd found interesting but argued had a fundamentally alien understanding of what motivated people to cross open space. She said this without any apparent awareness of the irony of an alien critiquing a human understanding of human psychology. I did not point this out. I thought it instead, and she caught it. She had always been very good at reading the thoughts I was choosing not to say, and her mouth pulled sideways in an expression that was the Velshari equivalent of finding something genuinely funny. It was such a precise, specific expression. I had not realized until I saw it again how specifically I had remembered it. You have the same face, she said. When you're thinking something you're not saying, you have a face for that. Everyone has a face for that. Not like yours, with you it's very clear, you get still. She tilted her head. You got very still when I came in. I said nothing to that. She smiled at me, a human expression she had adopted at some point during those 3 years, which the Velshari do not naturally use, and which somehow looked entirely natural on her face. After dinner, she took me through a series of corridors that went deeper into the palace complex than the public wings, down a level, through a door that required her palm and her retinal pattern and a spoken command code. The room on the other side was temperature-controlled and dimly lit and lined, floor to ceiling, with what I recognized after a moment as the deep archive. Physical copies of ancestral memory are stored in crystalline matrices. The Velshari discovered early in their civilization that the biological preservation method, while more precise, was vulnerable to trauma and death, and that a secondary physical archiving process was useful backup. The crystals are about the size of a large egg and they hold memory the way amber holds insects, perfectly, indefinitely, with a quality that is more than recording and less than life. Lyra walked to a specific shelf without looking for it. She knew exactly where it was and took down a crystal that was slightly darker than the others. She held it out to me. This was catalogued 4 months ago, she said, when the archivists were processing my mother's estate. I took the crystal carefully. It was cool against my palm. I can't read these, I said. I know, I'm going to tell you what it contains. She sat down on a low bench and folded her hands. My mother kept a private archive, not the public record, the formal history, her own. Things she observed and thought and felt that she never shared with the court. She paused. She archived the 3 years of the diplomatic summit, all of it. I understood then. I waited. She archived you, Lyra said. Her impression of you over 3 years, her assessment of what you were doing with me and why, a pause, and what she thought it would become. The temperature in the room was exactly right for conservation purposes. I was very aware of it. I had not been in the archive room before. My previous visits to Velshari Prime had been formal diplomatic occasions, 3 of them across 14 years, each one requiring enough time and paperwork and interspecies protocol coordination that they served their own purpose of keeping me very occupied. The first had been 8 years after my original posting, when the Velshari Conclave signed the Extended Cooperation Treaty with the ICC and needed a human liaison present who already had established relationships at the court. I had volunteered for that one, told myself it was because my existing clearance made me the efficient choice, and spent 3 days in the palace complex attending formal functions, and not, at any point, going to the nursery wing, which was now empty because Lyra was 19 and living in the young royal's residential quarters, and also because going to the nursery wing would have required admitting to myself why I wanted to. The second had been 11 years after, a trade dispute involving ICC member worlds and 2 Velshari allied houses that had escalated past the point where a video conference was sufficient. I had been sent because my reputation in multi-species negotiation was by that point well established, and also because one of the junior diplomats at the ICC had assigned me to it without knowing the specific nature of my prior connection to the Velshari court. And by the time I found out, canceling would have required an explanation. Lyra had been at that meeting. She was 22, 1 year into her reign, and she had sat at the head of the negotiating table with the quality of someone who had been absorbing the specific dynamics of rooms like this since childhood, which she had, and who had made a decision before the meeting started about exactly how much leverage to apply and when, which she had, and who was not going to acknowledge my presence beyond the formal diplomatic courtesy exchange at the opening of the session, which she did not. She was right to do it that way. We both knew it. A queen who visibly distinguished a human diplomat from all the other human diplomats in the room was a queen handing those diplomats an interpretive frame they hadn't asked for. She treated me with exactly the same courtesy she extended to everyone else, and I treated her with exactly the same courtesy I extended to her. And the meeting ran 3 days and ended in a settlement that satisfied all parties, and I went back to Meridian Station and started accepting every long-haul assignment that came across my desk. The third visit had been 2 years ago, pre-summons, when I had come as part of an ICC delegation to the Velshari Cultural Conference, and had managed, through what I told myself was entirely natural social circumstance, and what was actually very deliberate navigation, to spend the entire 4 days in the academic wing attending lectures on xenobiology without once being in the same room as the Queen. I had, in retrospect, put an enormous amount of effort into being very naturally not anywhere near her. What did she think? I asked. Lyra looked at the crystal in my hands and then at me. She thought you were the first person outside our bloodline who had ever treated me as if I was a person who would have to live in the world, rather than a function the world was built around. She said this without expression, the way she always delivered things that carried weight. She thought you were careful with me. She thought you were honest with me in ways that were appropriate for a child and would have been easy to avoid. She paused. She thought you were in love with a child, which would be wrong, and that you knew it, which was why you were so careful, and that you would probably spend a long time making yourself very busy after you left so that you didn't have to think about what it would mean if you came back when she wasn't a child anymore. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when something very large is sitting in them. She was an exceptionally perceptive woman, I said carefully. Yes, said Lyra, she was. She was also, this is the part I want you to understand, she was worried about you. Not about me, about you. She looked at the crystal again. She thought it would make you lonely, the waiting. She thought you were the kind of person who would wait without meaning to and without admitting it, and who would be very good at being busy while the waiting happened, and that the loneliness would be the kind you couldn't explain to anyone because the explanation would sound wrong from the outside. I looked at the crystal in my hand. It was cool and dark and held a dead woman's memory of me, trying to understand what I was doing in her daughter's life. Ambassador Velkori was very kind, I said. She was, said Lyra. She was also right. She stood up. You are very good at being busy. You are very good at logistics and problem solving and making yourself useful. You are very good at not being anywhere I was. She came and stood close enough that I had to look up at her. She had an inch on me in height and looked at me with all four eyes again. You had 14 years. Was it enough? Or do you need more? I thought about the 11 days on the persistent doubt, the heater, the ceiling, the things I'd thought about lying in the bunk. No, I said, I don't need more. Something changed in her face, something small and specific and very real. Good, she said, because I've been carrying 300 years of ancestral pressure behind my eyes, and I am 25 years old, and I did not have you summoned across 11 days of transit to let you leave without answering the question. You only asked me to come, I said. The message said I want answers. You didn't specify the question. You knew what the question was. I admitted to myself, known what the question was. Then yes, I said. The answer is yes, to whatever form of yes is appropriate here. The form that isn't too fast and isn't too careful and doesn't insult either of us by pretending we haven't been circling this for a very long time. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she took the crystal from my hands very carefully and returned it to its shelf. Tomorrow, she said, I have a full day of court functions. The state ceremony is in 3 days and I have to be present for approximately 7 hours of preparation protocol that is mandatory and that I find genuinely tedious. She turned back. I would like you to be there. Not at the ceremony, in the preparation room, so I have someone to complain to about the protocol. I understood. With the Velshari, courtship begins with being admitted to the tedious parts. I'll be there, I said. She walked me back to the guest wing. At the door she stopped and looked at me with that particular quality of attention she'd always had, the too-focused look that meant she was taking in two things at once, my face and whatever was behind me and whatever was coming next. You know, she said, when you came to the nursery that first morning, I threw the cup because I wanted to see what you'd do. I know, I said, you were testing me. I wanted to see if you'd leave. I thought about this, and you picked up the piece and offered it back to me, she said. I thought that was strange. I'd never had anyone do that. She tilted her head. I've been thinking about it for 14 years. I had not known that she'd been thinking about it. I had thought about it myself. The impulse had been simple, almost automatic, the instinct of a person who does not like waste and who saw something broken that still had a form worth keeping. I had not understood, at 26, that a royal child who had never been offered back a thing she'd broken might find that gesture remarkable. Get some sleep, she said. You've been traveling. She went inside, the door closed. I stood in the corridor for a moment. The palace was quiet the way places are quiet when they are occupied and settled, the quiet of a breathing thing at rest. Through a high window down the corridor, I could see 3 of Velshari Prime's moons, not all rising in sequence but simply present, hanging in the dark the way moons do when they've been at it long enough to be unhurried about it. I went to my room. I did not lie awake. The next morning, before the court day started, I walked the nursery wing. I had not planned to. I was walking the outer corridors of the residential quarter to orient myself, old habit, new palace wing, and I turned a corner and recognized the architecture, the stonework pattern, the particular height of the ceiling. I stood at the end of the corridor for a moment and looked at the door at the far end and thought about whether to go on. I went on. The nursery suite had been converted. It was a conference room now, neutral furniture, diplomatic neutral color palette, the kind of blank official space that can be used for anything and therefore seems to have been used for nothing. The windows were the same. The light through them was the same morning light. I stood in the center of the room and did the thing that you do in rooms where something important happened, which is to try to remember the exact arrangement of the original and find it where the new configuration has left traces. The hearth was still there, filled in now, but the original stonework surround remained, and I could see from the pattern of wear on the floor tiles in front of it where the hearthrug had been. Lyra had done most of her formal lessons on that rug, cross-legged, with her books arranged in a specific order around her that she called the system, and that looked, from the outside, like chaos, but that had an internal logic I'd eventually learned to read. She had corrected me once, when I moved one of the books while cleaning up, and the correction had been so precise and so brief, and so entirely without apology, that I had immediately understood I was dealing with someone who had already decided how things worked, and simply needed the people around her to catch up. She was 11. She had been running her own interior systems for 11 years with very little outside input, and she was exceptionally good at it. What she needed from me, I understood this later, much later, when I'd had enough distance to see it, was not guidance. She had guidance. She had advisors and tutors and a mother who was brilliant at many things. What she needed was someone who would be guided by her, someone who would take her seriously as the authority on herself. I had been that, almost by accident. I had been it because I was 26 and the only instinct I'd had on that first morning was to not run, and because the second instinct had been to pick up the piece, and because she had been so startlingly specific in her needs that if you actually paid attention to her, she told you exactly what to do, and it was very easy to be useful. I had not understood at the time that being useful to her and caring about her were becoming the same thing. They had felt like two separate tracks for most of those 3 years. They had merged somewhere in the second year, and I had not acknowledged the merge until approximately the 47th day of the original posting, when I had been sitting in the adjacent room going over diplomatic briefings, while she worked on her formal history essays, and she had read aloud, without looking up, a passage she was particularly proud of, and I had listened to it, and told her the second sentence was the best thing in it, and she had made a small sound of satisfaction and gone back to work. And I had sat with the diplomatic briefings untouched for the next 10 minutes, just being glad she was there. I had filed that moment under inadvisable and moved on. I stood in the conference room that used to be the nursery suite for about 4 minutes. Then I went to find coffee and put everything I just thought into the locked cabinet of thoughts that had been getting very full for 14 years. The deep archive, as I understood it better over the following days, was not just a memory storage system. It was how the Velshari understood continuity, the thread that connected a person to all the people who had been them before. Every queen for 300 years was in that room. Every decision, every fear, every small moment of grace or error. The archive did not judge. It preserved. It kept faith with the past not by pretending it was better than it was, but by keeping it exactly as it was, whole and complete and available, so that the people who came after could understand where they stood. I spent an afternoon in the archive room on the second day. Lyra had given me access clearance, which was not a casual gesture in Velshari terms, access to the private archive being something extended only to members of the royal household, and I walked the shelves slowly, not touching, just looking at the crystals in their orderly rows, each one labeled in the small script of the archivist's notation, a name, a date, a brief content indicator, thousands of them, generations of them, the whole long record of what had been. I thought about the particular quality of that kind of continuity. The Velshari didn't lose their past. It was all here, not reconstructed, not re-narrated, but preserved in the texture of direct experience, so that a Velshari who accessed the archive from 300 years ago would not be reading about what happened but entering, partially and incompletely, what it felt like to be there, what the light was doing, what the weight of the air was, the specific quality of a specific moment kept. They had built an entire culture around the practice of keeping things exactly right, not polishing them, not improving them, not selecting the moments that made the historical record look clean. Keeping what was, including the failures, the fears, the things that didn't resolve tidily, the moments where the right thing wasn't done and the queen of 300 years ago knew it, and the archive kept that knowing too. I found that I respected this enormously, and also that it made me understand Lyra better in a way I hadn't expected. She had grown up inside this culture of exact preservation. She did not soften what she thought. She did not revise her impressions after the fact to make them more comfortable. When she told me, that first night, what her mother's archive held, she did not frame it carefully. She said what was in it and left it there. Even the parts that might have been easier to soften, the interpretation of what I'd been feeling, the suggestion that her mother had understood something about me that I hadn't fully let myself understand. She delivered without hedging, without the cushioning that most people apply to things that might land hard. This was not cruelty. It was the deep archival instinct. It was how you kept faith with what was real. Humans don't have that. We have history, the things we chose to write down, shaped by whoever did the writing. We have memory, imperfect, reconstructive, prone to editing in our favor. We have stories we tell about ourselves that drift, over time, away from what actually happened, and toward what we wish had happened or fear had happened or need to have happened to make sense of who we are now. I thought about this on the morning of the second day, while I was eating breakfast on my balcony and watching the formal garden wake up. The Velshari garden staff moved with a quiet efficiency through the early light, tending things. There was a particular moment when the sun cleared the eastern wall and hit the formal hedges at a specific angle, and the color of them shifted from gray-green to something almost gold. And the shift was so sudden and so complete that for a moment the whole garden looked like a different place. I thought, this is what it is. Not a wall that fell or a crisis that was resolved. Just this, a light shifting, a garden changing from one thing to another all at once, a moment that only happened because you'd been there long enough to see it. The preparation room was exactly as tedious as Lyra had promised. The protocol for a Velshari state ceremony involves a series of ritual garment applications that must be performed in a specific order by authorized attendants, while the sovereign remains in a state of formal stillness. There are 4 layers to the full state dress, and each layer has its own set of required acknowledgments, and the whole process takes approximately 3 hours when it runs on schedule, which according to the chief protocol officer it had not done in living memory. Lyra stood in the center of the room with the particular still quality of someone who has been doing this since childhood and has learned to go somewhere else in their head, while their body remains available for the protocol. Her 4 eyes were at half attention. I was seated on a low chair against the wall, which was where she'd pointed when I arrived, and I was watching the process with the anthropological attention I'd developed over years of diplomatic work. "It's the 7th layer that's the problem," I said quietly, after the 3rd garment had been applied, and the attendants were conferring about something with visible frustration. "There is no 7th layer," said Lyra. "In the formal documentation there is. It was added during the 3rd Velashian reign, and then quietly removed, but the removal was never formally noted in the protocol index, which means the attendants are still cross-referencing against a document that includes it. I had read the briefing packet thoroughly on the persistent doubt because there had been very little else to do. If you tell the chief protocol officer to reference section 41 of the revised index rather than section 41 of the original, the discrepancy should resolve. Lyra looked at me with 2 eyes. "How do you know that?" "I read the briefing packet." "The briefing packet is 400 pages. "I had 11 days, I said. The heater made noise. "I couldn't sleep." She turned her head slightly and spoke to the chief protocol officer in rapid Velshari that I understood about 60% of its speed. But I caught the key references, and the officer's expression shifted from stressed to visibly relieved, and 6 minutes later the process was back on track. The chief protocol officer looked at me once during this exchange, with an expression I had learned to read in diplomatic contexts across multiple alien cultures, which translates roughly as, "I have no idea who this human is, but I am very glad they're here." "You know," said Lyra, returning to formal stillness while the fourth layer was being applied. I could have had my archivists resolve that discrepancy. Yes, I said. But then you wouldn't have had anything interesting to tell me about. She looked at me again with the too-focused look. I had the menu from the nursery prepared, she said. I thought you might have forgotten it. I remembered it, I said. I know you remembered it, she said. I wanted you to know that I remembered that you remembered it. This is how the Velshari communicate things that are important. Indirectly, in layers, the way the archive stores memory, not the fact itself but the fact's relationship to other facts, and those relationships to still other things. You don't say I've thought about you for 14 years. You say I remembered that you remembered. You let the shape of the thing speak. I had spent 14 years in diplomatic work learning to read exactly this kind of layered communication from a dozen different alien cultures. I had also spent 14 years in diplomatic work not applying it to myself. The state ceremony was held in the Lattice Hall, which is the great public receiving room of the Velshari Palace, and which does something extraordinary with light. The hall's ceiling is composed of thousands of panes of the mineral the Velshari call deep crystal, which diffracts light into component wavelengths, but with a variable quality that shifts with the angle of the sun. At the ceremony's hour, mid-afternoon, the sun at its highest approach angled to the hall's north-facing windows. The light coming through the ceiling was not quite any color. It was between things. It moved slowly across the assembled court like weather. I was positioned in the diplomatic gallery with the other ICC representatives, which gave me an elevated view of the hall's floor and the formal processional route. The ceremony involved 3 hours of ritual acknowledgement, tribute presentation, and formal address that I found, if I am honest, genuinely moving in a way that I had not expected. The Velshari ceremonies encode meaning in the physical arrangement of participants as much as in the words, and the particular arrangement of this ceremony. A new queen in her 4th year receiving tribute from allied houses, 300 years of precedent in the archive room below the hall's floor, was dense with things that were said without being said. Lyra was extraordinary at ceremony. She had always had that quality of being entirely present, entirely attentive, without performing either of those things. She stood at the center of the Lattice Hall's light and received tributes and gave formal address and moved through 3 hours of protocol with a specific gravity that was not dignity exactly. Dignity can be performed, but something more like the quality of someone who has genuinely decided to be where they are. I watched her for 3 hours. At no point during that time did she look at the diplomatic gallery. At the end of the ceremony, when the formal recession had concluded and the public hall was beginning to clear, I was still in the gallery organizing my program notes when she appeared at the gallery door. "You stayed," she said. I said I would, I said. She came into the gallery and stood at the railing looking down at the emptying hall. The light through the deep crystal ceiling had shifted with the sun's angle and was now doing something very different, warmer, more amber than that between-color quality. The hall below looked gilded. "I want to show you something else," she said. This time she took me up rather than down. The palace has a series of maintenance levels above the public floors, engineering access, atmospheric systems, the kind of infrastructure that keeps a very large, very old building functioning. The access shaft was narrow and lit by the Velshari equivalent of emergency lighting, which produces a pale silver glow. We climbed for about 5 minutes and came out through a hatch onto the roof of the Lattice Hall's central dome. The city of Velshari Prime spread out in every direction around us in the early evening light. Not the formal view from a designated overlook, the actual city, with all its inhabited texture, the layered architecture of buildings that had been added to over centuries, the navigation lights of small craft moving at low altitude, the places where old and new construction sat next to each other in the visible record of time, the distant towers going to gold in the last sunlight, and the nearer streets going to shadow. My mother used to bring me up here, said Lyra. She said it simply, when the formal demands were very bad. She said it was important to remember that the palace was inside the city, and not the other way around. I said nothing. This felt like a moment that did not need an addition from me. She archived this too, said Lyra. The view from here on specific days. I found the crystals when I was processing her archive. I knew what each one was for. She looked at the city. She kept a copy of the view from this roof on the day she was coronated, on the day my eldest brother was born, on the day the treaty with the outer reaches houses was signed. A pause. On the day my father died. She was keeping a record of the important days, I said. She was keeping a record of the days she wanted to remember exactly right, Lyra said. Not as she wished they'd been, as they were. She turned to me. Do you remember the roof, the garden roof, when I fell asleep? Yes, I said. What do you remember? I thought about this carefully, because it was the kind of question she had always asked that deserved a careful answer. I remember the moons, 3 of them in sequence. I remember that you told me about the archive, about the pressure. I remember carrying you back inside and thinking that I had no idea what to do with the fact that you were remarkable. She was quiet for a moment. I remember your shoulder, she said, the specific weight of it. I was half asleep and I couldn't see your face, and I remember thinking that you felt like someone who was going to stay. A pause. And then you left. I was always going to leave, I said. That was the posting. I know, she said. I'm not, she stopped, restarted. The Velshari are very precise with language when they're trying to say something exactly right. I'm not reproaching you for leaving. I'm telling you that the reason I threw the cup that first morning was that I already knew. I knew you were going to leave because that's what postings were. I'd had 17 companions in 11 years and they all left. I wanted to know before I let myself. She paused again. I wanted to know if you'd leave badly. If you'd leave the way the others left, which was cleanly and without looking back, because looking back made the leaving harder. I wanted to see if you would pick up the piece. I understood then, not just about the cup, about all of it. You've been waiting to see if I'd pick up the piece, I said. I've been waiting to see if you knew there was a piece to pick up, she said. That's different. The city below us was fully in its evening now. The transition moment passed, the lights coming on in the residential quarters, the sky doing the particular thing Velshari Prime sky does at this hour, where the natural bioluminescence of the native atmospheric algae gives the dusk a faint green edge that you don't see until it's there, and then it's everywhere. Not dramatic, just present. The way things that have always been there become visible when the light shifts. Lyra, I said. Yes, she said. I knew there was a piece to pick up, I said. I knew it that morning. I've been carrying it for 14 years. She looked at me. With all 4 eyes, the way she looked when she was entirely present and entirely decided. Good, she said, so have I. We stood on the roof of the lattice hall while Velshari Prime came into its evening. The moons were not up yet. It was too early, but the green edge of the algae-lit dusk was doing its slow, unhurried work across the sky, turning the dark from simply dark to something inhabited. She did not take my hand. That is not how the Velshari begin. What she did was stand close enough that her shoulder touched mine, the way someone stands beside something they have decided to be beside, not demonstratively, not for anyone watching, simply because that is where they've decided to be. I stood beside her. The political considerations arrived on the morning of the 4th day, in the form of a Velshari court official named Velmaru, who asked to meet with me in the small receiving parlor adjacent to my guest suite, and who had the bearing of someone performing a duty they found distasteful but necessary. Velmaru was senior court advisor, which in the Velshari hierarchy is an appointed position that carries significant formal weight and almost no actual power over the sovereign's decisions, but a great deal of unofficial influence over how those decisions are received by the rest of the court. He was tall even for the Velshari. They average about 4 centimeters over me, and he had another 5 on top of that. And his 4 eyes were very still, which with the Velshari means someone is exercising control over a strong feeling. "I want to be direct with you," he said, after the formal opening courtesies. "Please," I said. I appreciated directness. I had spent enough years in rooms where everyone was very courteous about saying nothing useful. "The Queen is exceptional," he said. "She is also young, and her reign is in a transitional period, and the alliances that the Velshari conclave depends on are in some respects more delicate than they have been at any point in recent history." He folded his hands. "A connection between the Queen and a human diplomat, regardless of the nature of that connection, would create a specific category of political complexity." "I'm aware," I said. "The outer reaches houses have been watching this court very carefully since the treaty negotiations of 3 years ago. Any perception that the Queen's judgment is being influenced by non-Velshari interests." He paused. "Velmaru," I said carefully, "I am a retired ICC diplomatic aide. I have no current political mandate, no active posting, and no authority over anything. I am here because the Queen summoned me. The nature of that summons is between the Queen and myself." "I understand that," he said. "I am telling you about the perception, not the reality." "The perception," I said, "is for the Queen to manage. She is 25, she is 4 years into a reign that has been by any metric extremely stable, and she is, as you said, exceptional. She is also the only person in this conversation who gets to decide what she does." He looked at me with all 4 eyes. It was not an aggressive look. It was, if anything, a look of genuine assessment, the look of someone deciding whether what they are seeing is what they think it is. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "In the original posting, the summit extended 3 times. You could have requested reassignment. Most diplomatic aides in that situation would have." I thought about this. I had thought about it before on the persistent doubt in the ceiling-staring hours. She was interesting, I said, and she deserved to be taken seriously. I paused. "That's not complicated." "No," he said slowly, "it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "The Queen has not asked my opinion of this situation." I noticed that. "She doesn't ask my opinion of most things," he said, and something shifted in his voice, not quite warmth, but something adjacent to respect. "She listens to my analysis. She discards my opinions. She is, in this way, exactly like her mother." He stood. "I will tell you this, and you may do with it what you will. Ambassador Velkori trusted you with her daughter. In the 3 years of your posting, she had 47 opportunities to have you reassigned, and she chose not to take any of them. I was her advisor then, as I am the Queen's advisor now, and I asked her once why she kept extending your mandate. She told me that you were the first person in Lyra's life who was clearly not going to be there for anything other than the right reasons." He straightened. "I am not telling you that this makes the political considerations irrelevant. I am telling you that I have been thinking about those words for 14 years. He left. I sat in the small receiving parlor for a few minutes after he was gone. The Velshari do not do this particular kind of oblique message, the thing said in the frame of an objection, the concern voiced in a way that is also, at the same time, a clearing of the path. I had worked with enough alien cultures to know that the idiom of meaning something is always particular to the species and the individual, and that Velmaru had just told me, in the specific Velshari way that certain things were communicated, that he was not actually here to stop anything. He was here to make sure I understood the weight of what I was walking into, and to confirm that I was someone who could carry it. The next morning I sent a message to the ICC logistics office on Meridian Station, informing them that I was extending my diplomatic leave indefinitely, and that my case files were available for reassignment. The logistics officer responded within the hour with a note that said, essentially, that they had been expecting this message for approximately 6 years and wished me well. That stung slightly. I mentioned it to Lyra over the morning meal. She looked at me with two of her eyes in that specific way she had, and her mouth pulled sideways. I spoke to the ICC director 3 years ago, she said, when I was trying to decide whether to send the summons. I set down my tea. You spoke to the director. I wanted to know if you were happy, she said. She said that you were very good at your work and very busy, and that she had never once heard you complain, and that she found this slightly concerning. She was watching me with that precise attention. She also said that you had turned down 3 postings in Allied sovereign spaces because you had a policy against extended stays in diplomatically significant locations that might create complications. She paused. I thought that was an interesting policy. I thought about 3 years of policy. It was a very well-reasoned policy. Yes, she said, it was the policy of someone who was being very careful about something. She took a breadstick from the plate between us. I should tell you, there will be specific protocols for whatever this becomes. Velshari courtship involving a sovereign requires documentation and witness processes that are frankly excessive even by my standards. And there will be political considerations. There are always political considerations. She broke the breadstick in half with a clean motion. I mention this so that you know exactly what you're walking into. I've been in diplomatic work for 14 years, I said. I'm familiar with political considerations. Yes, she said, but the political considerations in this case will also involve people telling you, in various polite ways, that you are a human and I am a Velshari sovereign, and that this is complicated. She handed me half the breadstick. I want you to know that I have already heard those arguments from approximately 15 different advisors, and that I found them all very thoroughly unpersuasive. I took the half breadstick. So did I said, every time I thought of one on my own. She looked at me. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do in all the years I'd known her, including the years when she was a child who threw cups and asked questions and fell asleep on rooftops. She laughed. Not a Velshari expression, an entirely human one, possibly learned from me specifically in that nursery in those 3 years. It was a small laugh, private, the laugh of someone who had been waiting a long time to laugh at something, and finding that the wait was retrospectively worth it. I thought, this is the best posting of my career. And this time, I was old enough to know what that meant. Later, much later, in the slow accumulation of much later that became the life we built, she would show me the archive crystal her mother had kept of me. She would help me understand what was held in it, translating the sensory impressions into language a human could follow. The visual record of a tall, quiet human man in a nursery, bending down to pick up a piece of broken cup, holding it out with the instinct of someone who does not believe in waste. The sound of his voice, low level, the voice of someone who understood that what a child in a rage needed most was not quiet but steadiness. The impression of his presence over 3 years as something that did not shift, depending on what was being asked of it. The archive did not record interpretation. It recorded what was. And what was, according to the Queen's mother's careful preservation, was a young human man who had been given a difficult posting and had simply, with no audience, no reward, no awareness that anyone was paying attention, decided to mean it. I had not known anyone was watching. But the archive had kept faith with it anyway, exactly as it was, whole and complete and available. On the evening of the 3rd month of my extended leave, Lyra brought me a crystal from the archive room and set it on the table between us without explanation. It was the one her mother had kept of the roof. The night the 3 moons rose in sequence, she, Lyra herself, through the biological sense that was her inheritance, had added to it. The same night, the same roof, but with a second awareness layered in. The specific texture of falling asleep against a human shoulder, the weight of it, the particular quality of someone who felt like they were going to stay. She kept the memory, I said, and you added to it. I wanted to preserve it exactly right, she said, not as I wished it had been. I looked at the crystal on the table between us. A room full of dead queens and one living one, keeping faith with what actually happened. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once, then she picked up her tea. Outside the balcony window, the 3 moons of Velshari Prime were all up, unhurried, simply present. The green-edged dark of the algae bloom spread across the sky the way it always had, the way it would long after we were both in the archive ourselves. Not dramatic, not announced, just there, visible because the light had shifted and the time had come, doing its slow and ancient work in the quiet.